Hello, and welcome to your creative and magical life, which is hopefully your actual life, but is also this podcast, which explores the intersections of tarot, creativity, magic, anti capitalism, social justice, and all sorts of metaphysical and mystical stuff, all with the goal of helping you cultivate a life that sparkles with magic and creativity. I'm your host, Cecily Saylor. I'm a tarot reader, a writer, a steward of creativity. I'm a double Capricorn who worships birds and dogs and all of nature. And I'm the creator of Typewriter Tarot, a project that helps people unleash their magic and creativity. Welcome to the podcast. I hope you enjoy it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's make some magic. Hello, creative spirits. Welcome to episode 7 of Your Creative and Magical Life. In this episode, we're exploring the Emperor, which is card number 4 in the Major Arcana. The Emperor is the first somewhat harsh archetype that we encounter in the progression of the Major Arcana. We start with the Fool, who looks pretty fun. Then there's the Magician, and making magic is always exciting. Then there's the High Priestess and all of her wisdom and knowing. Then the Empress and all of her lushness and creativity. But then marches in the Emperor, looking very serious, like he wants to shut down all the fun. So I'm excited to get into this card because it's been a challenging card for me, especially initially working with tarot. And over time, I've really grown to have a deep appreciation for the Emperor. So the conversation you'll hear, I think, will do the same for you. And it even expanded further my understanding of the Emperor. Our guest on this episode is Kelly Marshall, who is a friend of mine, a yoga therapist, a tarot practitioner, a quintessential Scorpio. And Kelly will share more about their life and experience and their thoughts on the Emperor. So let's dive right in. Hello, Kelly. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
But let's start with you, if that's cool. And
Mhm.
can we talk a little bit about the many things that you do and the way that you serve the community?
First and foremost, I identify as a yoga therapist and a writer. Those would be the two things I would lead with. And so I work with individuals and groups with the tools and the techniques and the philosophies of yoga. I've been a massage therapist and a body worker for 15 years now. I take a trauma-informed approach. I work with the nervous system. So we talk about nervous system resiliency and work. And it was through that work that I would consistently have experience with clients where they would become embodied and be working with uh, having more awareness of the nervous system states and their emotional states. And they would say things like, this experience I'm having with you is reminding me of my relationship with my mother. And I would have to tell them that they needed to talk to their therapist about that in order to stay within my scope of practice in terms of being body oriented. And I got really tired of that experience happening over and over again over the course of the pandemic. And I went back to school as a non-traditional student. And I was like, I'm almost 40 and I don't have any debt. It would be a really great idea is to go to school. So I'm finishing up my bachelor's program for social work. I'm going to get my master's in social work, and I intend to become a licensed clinical social worker here. Hopefully, maybe about in a few more years. It'll take a minute, but in the meantime, I work to serve the community. I'm transgender. I'm non-binary. My pronouns are they them, which is interesting that we're talking about the emperor because it's a very masculine. It is. It's the man. It's the father. Card and archetypal energy in a lot of ways, I've been actively working with the archetype of the emperor and the empress simultaneously for the past, I guess, couple of years now. And so it's fortuitous that we're kind of talking about the energies of this card, and how it shows up for people. So
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you. We'll come back into that Empress Emperor spectrum in a moment, but I thought we could talk a little bit about the card itself and what it looks like. And just thinking initially about the Smith Rider Waite deck.
So we have a man in a red robe and wearing full armor underneath it, silver metal armor. He's sitting in a stone throne adorned with ram's heads at the arms and at the top of the throne. In his left hand, he is holding a golden orb, and in his right hand, he is holding a scepter. And behind him appears to be mountains with a very little stream of water at the base of these mountains, kind of passing along the the back of his stone throne. And he appears to be older. He's wearing a crown, and he's got a very long white beard and long white hair.
Yeah. And those mountains look very stony, like they are not covered in trees. They're just like the Rockies kind of.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of stone, like with the mountains, with the throne, and with the armor too. There's all this like hardness, a lot of hard textures compared to the Empress, which she's surrounded by nature. The stream plays a more prominent role in her imagery. What do we make of the hardness of this card?
It's interesting because when you talk about the hardness, I also notice there's aspects there are aspects of movement or flow, like red is the color of passion. A lot of the time, Aries, the sign Aries, is associated with this card. And then you notice in his face, it's not like totally, what he's got like rosy cheeks a little bit. So
Mm.
like there might be something underneath all of that, some kind of contained emotional force, maybe. So, but what I make of kind of that sense of hardness, or the mountains behind him and the throne that seems very solid, and then of course he's wearing his full suit of armor underneath his robe, is a sense of like, I think it speaks to established order. Sometimes a shadow aspect of the emperor is a sense of rigidity, right? And a sense of being an immovable object. So that's what kind of comes up for me initially when we look at this.
I think this card is challenging for female identifying folks or folks who've grown up in female bodies. When they pull this card, there's a kind of recoil, perhaps, or this just inability to kind of connect with what this could mean. Have you noticed that? Do you think that's true?
Uh,
Do you have
yeah,
any insight on why that might be?
I'm like, oh, we don't identify or relate to an old white man.
With a lot of power?
Okay. With a lot of power, does that not feel good for us? I mean, maybe it's a little too on the nose, right? But I think that, yeah, the wounds from patriarchy are really awake when we look at this card. And so I don't know, when I'm thinking about archetypal work, like archetypal work comes from Jungian ideology, right? And Jungian ideology says that like all archetypes are very similar, in the sense of like he likes to say that like archetypes are a human experience, and that we all have a relationship with archetypes as humans on the planet. But to me, archetypes are very cultural, and within the framework of Western colonialism, within the framework of patriarchy, within the framework of oppression, and of being under these oppressive experiences, especially if you are assigned female at birth, in this day and age, in the age of Trump, I would say, yeah, for sure, it evokes a lot of a sense of recoiling, or like, how can I identify with this energy when we're looking at the picture or the depiction of it, and it is depicting sort of the face of the oppressor?
Yeah, so I love what you said about the emperor kind of representing the oppressor, that especially in late stage capitalism, we really see and feel everywhere around us, like the state, the systems. And the emperor kind of functions as a father figure in the tarot, like it's part of that first line of the major arcana, where if we zoom out, we can sort of see that first line as like coming into the early phases of human development. And the Empress is kind of like the mother that gives us nurturing and sort of connects us to things. And the father, the emperor, comes in to sort of present the social order to us, to help us like navigate how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to engage with like the human systems around us. And for those of us living in 2024, there are so many entrenched systems that we're faced with, and we kind of feel them everywhere we go. And at the same time, the kind of like authority that the emperor seems to embody is something that very few women, I think, ever get to really step into without major backlash.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a lot to be said around this, because I think that there is definitely a way that is not gendered to step into your daddy energy. And I'm excited to talk about that too, because that's something that I'm continually coming to terms with in myself, is how do I embody the archetypal energy of the emperor in a way that is healing, not only for myself, embodying that energy in my life, but also for the people around me. How can I bring these aspects to the fore in a way that's supportive, um, and even an aspect of, there's a supportive aspect. I want to say nurturing, even though that sort of word is the domain of the Empress. I think that in a world that is fully fully realized of the wholeness of the totality of like a healing experience of power. I think where we get in trouble is we get into these binary concepts of power, and we sort of, by virtue of our experience of being under the oppressive, guise of patriarchy and of white colonialism and of capitalism, it does have that face. But what we're having to do in that experience is we're sort of othering the energy, the daddy energy that the emperor evokes. And what I've really had to do with that energy is try to find ways where evoking, the spirit of the emperor is a place where it creates foundation and structure to build a new world, right? So at the same time that we're trying to deconstruct what exists, in terms of the world as it is, we also have to keep in mind, well, how can we build something new? How can we build a new sense of moving through the world that is honoring what injuries this old structure has created? And that's, we're sort of getting esoteric here, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. And yeah, I just wanted to like lead with what I see is kind of like the glaring challenge of receiving the emperor sometimes. But then when you kind of when you get out of the binary and the gendered part of it, if you look at the archetype more as just like an energy, the emperor has this function of providing order and structure and helping to kind of organize people. And, as humans multiplied, right, and lived in more and more dense communities, a lot of questions come up about resource sharing and where we live and where we put like different parts of our communal existence. And the emperor, in that sense, kind of functions in terms of, or let's say a balanced, healthy emperor would be someone who could look from a kind of higher perspective at what the collective needs and, create boundaries, let's say, and kind of create buckets or spaces where certain things can go and where, oh, if I need this, I would go there. And possibly also helping people in the collective kind of, I don't think a single human is meant to do like a single thing their whole life. Like you weren't put on the planet, let's say, I'm thinking like in medieval terms, like you're only supposed to make shoes for everybody, right? Um, Unless that's what you like, that's your great love, then yeah. But and so the emperor might like help people get into a role where they feel like they're in service to the collective and also utilizing their talents in a good way and receiving something in exchange for what they offer. So that's how I feel like the emperor can kind of guide us in terms of, or that's one level, I guess, how the emperor can guide us in terms of like moving a collective in a organized, structured way. Does that feel true to you?
Yeah, and the word that's popping out to me when you're talking about those things is the word organize. When we're talking about social justice, particularly, like you have to organize in order to create movements for change, right? You need
Hmm.
the emperor energy in order to create a new world. And I think that's where the emperor has really supported me in my work in social work school and navigating institutions, which the emperor rules is like, this is the order of operations and this is how we need to go about things and how do we create, um, pathways to success through step A, step B, step C, right? That kind of thing. And me as a person, I have a hard time with authority and institutions. It's a hard thing for me to go into as a activist, as a trans person to kind of go into the fray, and then also my own experience of having lived most of my life as a woman and being like, oh man, now I look like that dude. Now I'm like doing that
You're that
thing
guy.
where I'm moving. Yeah, I'm that guy. How can I don't want to be that guy. Let's not be that guy. They're my
I'm kidding.
yeah. So the way that I feel that the emperor can be really, really a healing energy is beyond the things like the to-do list, right? Or of like it's really about how do you enact the changes that you want to make in a way that is a step-by-step process, that gets you to where you want to go, and even if it's movement in the right direction and understanding that you'll have to pivot. But I do think that the space that the emperor holds, that's really in its balanced state, is not a ruler but a facilitator
Mm.
that's holding a container, for change, and is directing the energy, for the collective to move into a new state of being.
Yeah. And if we take that into like an organizing framework, it's questions like who all is here? Do we have enough people? Who else can we engage? What actions might be most powerful in initiating change? Who can play certain roles within those actions? How do we break those actions down step by step? And then also, what do we create on the other side? Like, what structures do we need for the vision that maybe we imagine the Empress has been holding for the next reality or the new future or whatever we want to call it? Like, how can we give that structure so it can be created?
I think the other piece for me is thinking about authority, the question who has authority in this, right? And befriending authority, right? Befriending the people who have authority and making a human to human connection with the people who are in authority is what I've found in my organizing work. I'm actually organizing here at social work school because there are unpaid uh, internships. And so when you start the field of social work, you are basically being unpaid for most of your school process, which then sets the precedent of being undervalued for the entire field. And so I'm going into this work into these institutions, and I'm talking to the faculty of my school. I'm talking to the people that are already established within the field who are like, yeah, we've wanted this change. We've wanted social work students to be paid. We've wanted to be paid more since the 1950s, but nobody has done anything about it. And so I'm able to, with the emperor energy, kind of come in to befriend people who ordinarily would be in a position of authority to me, to be like, no, I actually see that you have this need too. You're also being underpaid in your experience. And how can we collectively work together to make a change with the power that you have? Right. And I think that's the real key thing to think about when we're talking about emperor energy, authority, and privilege is like I'm aware that the position that I hold in society now is I look like a white cis man, therefore I have to behave accordingly in some ways, even if I don't identify with that at all. Like what people see is the privilege that I'm afforded. So what do I do with that privilege or that authority that I have? How can I simultaneously share that power or that door opening space and also divest from it and step down or step away from that, like. And so that's a question that comes up for me around the emperor archetype, is like, how can I share this power, and how can I also make sure that I'm like that I have a bird's eye view of the privilege that I have to be in this position, to be on this throne.
Yeah, that's awesome that you're doing that. I celebrate you for that. And it's hard to be going through school and be an organizer in while you're like simultaneously. Also, kind of like it's hard to have a job and then also be organizing a union while you're working 9 to 5. So shout out to everyone who's doing that. But thinking about what you just described, it's like it's only recently that I really accepted or noticed how much academia is also like a fundamental function of capitalism, and it
Hmm.
repeats a lot of the same problems we suffer in capitalism. On the one hand, education's amazing, and I went to college and I got a master's degree sometime after that. Um, and I love learning and getting an education and all of that. But like you're talking about, there's so much labor extraction in higher education institutions. If you look at where the money flows, it's like athletics and then everything else a little bit. And so you're like inside kind of like an emperor system that's kind of barely it's like still it's kind of crumbling and like not super effective, and you're bringing this like fresh emperor energy into that space to maybe create a different system, and I think that's amazing. And I also want to say what you pointed out about othering, I think is really important. That yeah, like maybe as a someone in a female body or who's identified as female for some time and looking at the emperor, it's like I don't know anything about this energy, and like this is the thing that's like making me feel bad in the world. And that otherizing, like even while we're fighting for inclusion, the otherization of the power holders makes it even harder to build the bridges. And so what you're doing, just going to some of the folks who are people who have some authority inside the system, where you're learning And having real conversations with them just seems super important.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to get into that mindset of like us versus them, especially with how divisive the political atmosphere is here. But the only way that we're going to create a new world is we're going to find people that maybe need to realize where they might be running up against their own best interests and defect, right? And come over here. And then the people that are really, by hook or by crook, just holding on to the old paradigm and are just not going to let it go, and just you recognize, okay, well, that's going to be that's going to be where you're at with that. And I think what I've come to terms with, especially within the context of social work school, is that social change is incremental and takes a really long time. And I think that's one of the energies of the emperor, is it's a slow moving energy, right? It talks about sustainability. And the only way that we can create sustainability is through sort of a methodical, kind of relentless, consistent kind of movement, and patience, having patience for that process, which drives me nuts, but that's real.
Yes, true and frustrating. Another element I think of with this card, when you kind of turn it toward the self, which I think we should do with every card we get, is this invitation to connect with the extent of your personal power. And I don't mean that in the kind of hierarchical power way where it's like, oh, how much power do you have to wield over other people? But how much power you have to lead yourself, to pursue the things that you care about, to speak up, to be a little more visible, and also to take ownership of your life as a person who has, obviously, we have constraints in these systems that we're talking about, but moment to moment, we have free will. And so, how can we kind of like take ownership of our lives and say, okay, well, I like this thing that's happening, but I'm really uncomfortable about this. And like, how did I create that? And also, if I want to see change, what are the things I can be doing? Where can my agency step in to facilitate that for me? And I deserve it. Like, I deserve the changes I want to see for
Mhm.
myself. And so that's been one way I've been able to kind of find a pathway into the emperor. Yeah, that kind of takes it a little bit out of that paradigm, but also stays within the kind of message I think the emperor offers.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense to me. I also think about, yeah, when you are moving into that space of I'm trying to create a new world, or I'm trying to create changes for myself, and step into something that I deserve, and step into my own authority, myself, my own agency for myself, my own self-sovereignty, right? We want to talk about the sovereign of the emperor. Is How are you making those movements on the daily? Like, what is that looking like in your routine, in your habits, in the relationships that you're cultivating? How are you building it? I'm thinking about like the language of building your own, you building your empire, right? And the idea of like, if you look at the self as a village, or if you look at the self as its own civilization, like what do your many selves need? What kind of ruler does your many selves need? And how can we hold the container for the many selves, and the different things that you need out of that space? Because yeah, we all contain, as we were saying before we started this episode, like we all contain multitudes. We all contain all aspects of the tarot. And when we're looking at this one piece, and we look at him as like, okay, he's the one who is creating the container, for all of the movement of the selves. How do we make that move forward?
Yeah, and I wonder, I like that analogy. I could see these little villages where there's little clones of each of us, except we're all like different ages and maybe wearing different outfits. And there's like the inner child self, there's like 20 versions of that. And then there's like the the self that wants to rebel, and there's the self that wants to accomplish, and there's the self that's creative, and then there's the emperor self who can help all of them come together and create a life that's creative and magical, let's say.
Did we just talk about internal family systems and parts work at the same time as talking about tarot? I think we just did.
We did. And I think tarot and internal family systems go beautifully together. Do you?
Hmm.
Something else, like another curiosity is arising in me, and I don't know if this will feel resonant for you or if anything will come to mind, but in that idea of like leading the self and self sovereignty, and in your work as a yoga therapist, if, let's say someone does come to you and they have, I don't know what kind of issue, but you see that it's like, it's a larger life issue, right? Like that's how the body gets out of whack is from whatever we're doing in our life. Is there an analogy or an example of like how an emperor energy could come in to sort of bring someone toward healing? Or is that just like a way too big question with too many possibilities?
No, I see what you're doing there. I see what you did there. I think what immediately came to mind for me was correlating the emperor with the body, because if we're talking about archetypal energy of like someone coming in as a healer or whatever, that to me would be like hero fan energy or hermit energy, someone who's the guide. But I think I want to go back to that concept of self-sovereignty. When we're talking about a healing container, and being a healing practitioner, the big thing in social work, when we're talking about case management and we're talking about meeting people therapeutically, is self-determination. And so the idea that you are actually your own best authority, you are your own best healer, and whether you know it consciously or not, you know the next thing that you need to do to help bring you into wholeness. And the mark of a really good healing practitioner is someone who recognizes that you are your own best authority on what is going to be most healing for you, and will support you in that, and will help you create a framework around a scaffolding around how do I move in this direction, and so that would be sort of the balanced, emperor energy is going, no, actually you are the one in charge, not me as the healer or the healing practitioner. You are the one who knows, so let's be curious about your own experience and your own self-determination about what the next step is for you.
Yeah. And then there's the possibility of breaking that down for someone so it isn't like all this stuff a person has to do to find healing, but patience, like you said, and the body as well being a system that recalibrates slowly and finds balance gradually. Like we can't just flip a switch in the body and everything's suddenly different. So in such a case, it's like, let's start with how you're sleeping, or let's start with like this one movement. Also, of course, maintaining that focus on the person knowing and having the full ability to guide themselves.
Yeah, I'll go even deeper and say that self-determination is a trauma-informed perspective, right? And if we're talking about being under these oppressive sort of structures, regardless of who you are, being able to advocate for what you need, and and having a safer space to find your voice so that you can advocate for what you need, be your own, sovereign in that sense. That is really a huge part of the healing work, at least it has been for me in my own trauma recovery, is knowing that I can and express myself, that I am safe to express myself and safe to express what my needs are. If not only just to like myself, but also to anybody who's like within the room with me, being like, oh, you know what? I've noticed that this is the thing I need. So yeah, that's what arises for me around that.
As we were thinking about this episode and preparing a little bit for it, there is the gendered part in a sense. And I want to first say that I think it's always wonderful and maybe well advised to be deconstructing gender in the tarot, especially if you're working with a deck that has pretty like gendered constructions. That said, is there's I think there's also like a worthy investigation here around like the masculinity we're shown in the emperor, or just an invitation to explore that. Does that make like am I giving that enough context? Like
Yeah,
we want to deconstruct the binary, but we
yeah,
can also talk about it.
yeah. And I think what's really interesting about masculinity and then gender in general is that it is so contextual to culture. And culture is always changing. And I think that's a really good thing when it comes to masculinity this day and age in this country right now. Like I think that masculinity and what it means to sort of be a man or to show up in that energy is being redefined, thankfully, I think, by the Empress feedback of like, this is not working for us anymore, this is not working at all, and so, get right, please. And I really appreciate that's kind of, we can kind of get into kind of the relationship between emperor and empress in that way. But yeah, to me, and this is something that I have my own challenges with, because I often am like, what even is masculinity? What even is femininity outside of the construct of a culture? And for me, I'm thinking about the word responsibility. And the key word in the word responsibility is response or responsiveness. And I think being willing to be responsive is the most important aspect of, I think, the masculinity aspect of the emperor, is reading the room, being responsive to what is happening and responsive to what your role might be or might not be in that space.
Yeah, I love that so much. And this, yeah, it's like, what if masculinity within our culture had a different responsiveness? Like, wow, that would be so interesting for one thing. Like, I think we see a lot of what we notice in the card. This like the emperor is wearing a very shiny armor under that red robe, which is passion, but is also like a Mars energy, a little bit of like a warfare energy to it sometimes. And those silver shoes that the emperor is wearing they look really uncomfortable and they're really pointy. And they could injure someone if that emperor got angry. And I feel like a lot of what we see in the masculine presentation, at least like writ large, from like the highest levels of power, let's say, in the culture that we're a part of, is this kind of like either indifference or a deflection or gaslighting, which is a form of deflection. And so that idea of responsiveness and responsibility, like having a responsibility to be responsive, which kind of gets me into like the daddy part. It's like we can have,
Hmm.
what kind of daddy did we have? Was he
Hmm.
responsive and in what kind of way? And that has so much to do with like how our lives are shaped or the healing journey that we might go on. Ask me how I
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think about, since we're moving into the daddy portion of this episode. I feel like my experience around daddy energy and being called into fatherhood, has been literal. I have literally been a stepfather in a marriage, and that was, we were like, the full-time custodial parents, so it was a real thing. I went to PTA meetings. I had a Costco membership, the whole nine yards. um like, I did the thing, and that was really at the beginning of my transition, where I was like, I must be dad now. I must be dad husband because I have now decided that I am transgender and I am going to take, it was a whole thing. And it is something that I think a lot of transmasculine people have to reckon with, is sort of like, well, I have chosen this, I have chosen to take steps, I am this, this is my identity, and now how do I make it my own, right? Like, so I had that experience, and then I have most recently, I think, traveled into the world of BDSM and power exchange, where I have been called into that role with others. And I appreciate that the role of daddy in so many different ways has not been something necessarily that I have chosen, but something that I have been called into. And I think that that makes it all the more powerful to, because you're being gifted the responsibility of that. And I think that there's a difference between being recognized that the responsibility of being a father or being a daddy is a gift that you're being given, as opposed to something you are entitled to, right? Or that something is your right to
Mm.
do or be. So that's huge for me, because when you are being given the gift of trust, of being in someone's intimate heart space, to support them in their own self-sovereignty, right? That is something that you have to lead by your own example, and then also make sure that the person that you are supporting in that space knows without a doubt that their boundaries and their needs and their experiences are their own and are going to be honored. Yeah, that's kind of what I'll say, cliff notes on that one, but feel free to ask more questions if you want.
Yeah, I don't know if you'll want to answer this, and of course you don't have to, but I'm curious how it feels. I'm sure there are many feelings, but how it feels to step into that daddy issue. Sorry, daddy. Whoops. uh,
Whoopsie.
that daddy role, and like, especially as someone who inhabited a feminine body for, the first half of your life, and to kind of switch into this other space and role and energy where you're really invited to do some like healthy daddy, but kinky.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that
a
too
great
personal?
question. No, it's not too personal at all. I mean, you know me, I'll go there. I
Scorpio.
think, yeah, I think the other thing to remember though is that, like, femmes can be daddies too,
Yeah.
and non-binary people can be daddies too, and like the embodiment of that energy is, it's really, I mean, I've heard another kink educator talk about it from the perspective of embodying the leader and the follower, and that those are
Mm.
roles that you have agreed upon to play with within a certain context, right? And it's contained within the context of the scene or the bedroom at that time. And I'm not going to speak to 24/7 relationships because I don't participate in those, and I don't feel that they're personally sustainable for me. But my own experience of embodying sort of that daddy energy or that daddy role is that it's been deeply healing for me, because of the trust that it takes to have that kind of relationship, and what it calls me into as a person, like how it calls me into growth as a person, because a lot of that at the front end, when I started kind of entering into that role, which again was sort of assigned to me, I didn't, a lot of these things, like I had my own sort of like, resistance around being someone who had that kind of who had that kind of authority in that way, because it calls me into a deeper sense of responsibility to myself. And that, I think, is what's really key about someone who is occupying a daddy role or a dominant role, is that it really makes you very responsible for yourself, because again, you are leading in your relationship, sexual or otherwise, by example, by showing up in your own responsiveness to yourself and your own needs in the way that you comport yourself in relationship. And so building trust, maintaining a sense of stability, maintaining a sense of responsiveness, and I am here for whatever arises in our relationship, and I'm here to listen to what you need to say, and I'm here for your boundaries, and I'm here for your wants and your needs and your feelings as well as my own, and I'm going to advocate for space for both of those things. All of that, it really called me into a lot of deep growth relationally and with my own sense of being responsible for myself.
That feels really powerful. And before we got on the call, you were saying, like, I don't feel very emperor today. I feel kind of king of cups, right? Or was it
Oh,
queen of cups?
I said no, yeah, King of Wands.
Oh, king of wands.
I
Okay.
Yeah, in this era in my world, I feel that I'm often pulling some kind of king, which I'm like, cool, okay, here you are. But yeah, King of Wands is that energy where we're feeling very passionate, we're feeling very creative, but we're not necessarily terribly emotionally contained at this moment. Whereas
Mhm.
like, I don't know, King of Pentacles or King of Cups would be pretty emotionally contained, I would say. I like look at those guys, or even King of like swords is like super emotionally contained, like very stoic, right? And I think about all the kings combined, being the totality of like the emperor energy. Like all four of those guys together is like the multitude of how emperor shows up.
Yeah. And what you were just describing, sort of setting the container in these relational spaces where relational dynamics can be kind of stretched and played with and expressed. And what you said about like holding emotional space or holding space for whatever emotions come up, that feels like the King of Cups really creating an alliance with the Emperor as a way of like for you to maybe imagine that role. And I'm interested about the healing. I imagine it's healing for your partners as well, but can you say more about like what's been healed in that process?
I think the emperor has made me more comfortable with process, with structure, with rules, with protocols. The emperor has made me more comfortable with being boring in a relationship, which also can create security and stability. The emperor has made me more comfortable with being presenting more consistently, so a consistent emotional environment, a consistent experience. And then in terms of boundaries, like I think the emperor rules boundaries, whether they're external boundaries about like how am I going to move through the world or through my relationships. It's created a lot of internal boundaries for me, like I'm not going to entertain that thought, or I'm not going to sort of go down that rabbit hole, or I'm not going to invest energy in that direction. I'm going to be really considerate of where my energy is going and where am I directing it at any given time. So those are a couple of like healing things that have come about it. I don't think that I could have like navigated going back to school, organizing, having two jobs, navigating polyamorous relationships, if I had not been thinking about the emperor and how we contain all of those different aspects of our lives, what boundaries we create internally and externally to be able to manage all those different spaces.
Yeah, that makes me think of energy leaks. And if the Emperor's maybe the overseer of the how the collective might be organized, whether that's the collective of the self or the collective of a group of people. There's a lot to do in the organizing, and there's so much to do in life. And I feel like the emperor would also be the one tasked with identifying leaks of energy, whether that's like, oh, this just totally unproductive thought loop that I get into over and over again, or the scrolling on Instagram that wastes like an hour of my time when I have a lot of other things to be working on.
Yeah, it's the arbiter of resource, right? That's
Yeah.
what the emperor does. It's like we're gonna manage resource. Where are the resources going?
And that's all
Because we have
energy.
a finite amount every day, you know.
We do indeed. Yeah. So let's bring the emperor into the room with the Empress, which was explored in an earlier episode. And in this early part of the major arcana, we have these two pairings. We have the magician and the high priestess. We can also see the magician, high priestess, and the fool is maybe like a threesome or something. And then we have another coupling with the empress and the emperor. So they're presented as counterparts or this kind of yin and yang energy early in the development of the archetypes or the evolution of the archetypes. So when we see them together, what's like a dream couple, a power couple? What would that look like with the empress and the emperor, either as two beings in who are united, or as two parts of the self that are working toward integration?
Yeah. Well, the first thing we want to say is like they're equal. Both equally powerful, right? So
Yes.
they're equals. It is an egalitarian relationship, and it must be right because they are counterparts, and so they do bring two things to the fore. And the thing for me and working with the emperor is that I don't work with the emperor exclusively. Maybe it's being non-binary. I don't know, but like I find that I can most fully access the emperor when I'm also holding the energy of the empress. Um, and so I think of it in terms of like different aspects of we have the generative part of ourselves, we have the part of ourselves that is open to possibilities, that likes to daydream, that likes to brainstorm, that's inspired, that is nonlinear, that's quite creative. And then we have the part of ourselves. It's like, well, how do I then make that manifest? How do I then put that into action? And that's like big strokes, right? Like, what's the next step to get this thing to substantiate what the Empress creates? How do we substantiate it with the Emperor? Yeah, and so to me, they do really have to work in tandem. And when you asked like what did the Emperor and the Empress look like, I immediately thought of like Beyonce and Jay-Z. I don't know why, but like to me, they're like I think of them as like Emperor Empress energy.
Yeah, I think we could correlate that.
What I also think about is when we're talking about the progression of the major arcana, we have after the Emperor, we have the Hierophant, and then after the Hierophant, we have the Lovers. And I almost think about it as like the story of an evolution of we have this idea, we have this process, this creative process that we're going through, then we substantiate it with the emperor. We like put some boundaries around it and we create structure around it so that we can actually make it happen. And then we have a connection with the divine. We have a sense of spreading that, disseminating that idea out to the masses, and then we have a sense of communion with like the lovers. And I think about like the emperor and the empress moving through the Hierophant energy and then becoming lovers. Like I have this, because all those energies kind of build on one another. So that's something that comes to mind for me. And especially like harkening back to what we were talking about with power exchange stuff is like, I think a lot of people get it twisted that there is like an inherent difference in power dynamics, and the understanding with that is that you are with someone who is your whole full equal, and they are exchanging power with you. They are for the moment, or for that container, playing a role with you. And I think that it's even helpful to think about how can the emperor then genuflect to the empress, right? And vice versa. Like, who steps forward when and why? What's the dance there? Is something that I play with a lot as a non-binary person working with emperor energy. Is like, what is the nurturing energy of the empress needed here? Is the softness needed here, or is there structure that's needed here, more firmness that's needed here?
I think that's really helpful because we can, if we're pulling the emperor just on its own, we can always invoke the empress. Like they always have something to do with each other. They don't exist independently, or they do, but they're they're informed or supported by the other. And so in certain moments you can be like, do I need 80% empress energy, 20% emperor energy? Do I need to, like, what kind of combination serves the moment? And then to kind of just offer an unideal example of how this couple could function. I think like kind of a worst case or a not so great case is that the is this sort of like traditional, the heteronormative kind of like marriage that we see a lot in our culture, or that's like repeated as a standard, I guess. And of course, this is kind of phasing out in a lot of ways, but it still exists where it's like the emperor is the breadwinner and the one who is outward facing and helps like organize the the society and like extracts the taxes and make sure all the bills get paid, and the empress is the child bearer and she gets to kind of go off on the lawn and like have a creative day and throw parties, and maybe they don't spend a lot of time together except in this sort of like formal presentation kind of way, because they maybe don't have even that much in common because they're so different in their functions and their forms. And it's kind of this performative division of gender roles, and there isn't that much love there. It's kind of like transactional, or the support for one and the other is a little bit empty versus like substantive and rich, where power kind of gets exchanged and is fluid and can be played with in different ways.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about heteronormative relationships and then also queer relationships. And I want to say, first of all, this is not all across the board, and I can't
Yes.
speak to heteronormative relationships consistently because I've only had a handful of them. Um, but speaking to queer relationships, particularly, and talking about the relationship between like emperor empress archetype, I think what's really key is that both energies are held in equal esteem and equal importance, and their wisdom for how to navigate maybe running the household, running the relationship is held in equal esteem, because the empress brings a lot of wisdom and knowledge about how to relate, and the emperor brings a lot of wisdom and knowledge about how to organize the relating, and if we're talking about those like high level, kind of how these cards would talk to each other if they were in an argument kind of thing, it would be that they would both be able to hear one another's truth around the way that they need what they need, right? And how they need to be in held in relationship, and that they are both able to just see each other's perspective. And I think that that's the space for hard conversations when you're both rulers, or you're both like individual people that have very strong personalities, we'll put it that way, is to have a lot of patience and space for the each person to have their own really individual needs and desires in a relationship. And this is salient because I'm reading Gottman's Fight right now, so plug for that book. But when we're holding space for two people to be their whole full sovereign selves in relationship and to be able to fully be seen in what they need and to have the other just recognize it for what it is without putting the lens of their own judgments about how they would be moving differently, but just to hear it and hold it and honor it, I think is super key. Because those conversations are hard to have and they're often sort of like skated by, I think, in the interest of sort of keeping up appearances or holding the peace. As people, there's a lot of like, I've noticed, like in heteronormative relationships, there's always sort of like, well, what do I not say, or how do I say this in a way that's not going to sort of trigger my partner, and how do I sort of manage the conversation in a way that's just going to keep the peace, when it's really, I think, creating a lot of safety for one another to just be like, look, like, this is how I feel, this is what's happening, and it's not your fault, it's just that we're different people, and how can we collaborate, how can we create a kingdom together, an empire together, with both of the things that we need held in equal esteem.
Beautifully said. And I think that circles back to your point about responsiveness. And I love that you brought up the point as well of like trying to pre-manage the truth for the other. Like,
Mm,
how can I kind of get my point across without provoking, right? Or
mhm,
creating like defensiveness or the other person feeling like they're under attack, or they're just being criticized.
mhm,
Yeah, and I think that takes a certain kind of like self-sovereignty and power within the self to say, what other people tell me isn't like a verdict on me, and I can be present for this other person's sovereignty and their experience and see what we can create together. What kind of structures do we need for these visions that we share or these visions that are competing? Should we ask the Emperor a question? Do you want to pull a card?
totally. Let me pull my deck. Or you have a deck. I'm
Yeah,
like
you or
automatically going
me.
from my deck.
We can do
What do
both.
you?
We
Okay,
can
we'll
both pull
do both.
cards.
All right, what do you got? What deck are you working with?
I have the Fyodor Pavlov deck. What do you have?
Nice. I've got the Brady Tarot.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. I have a question for the Emperor, so I'll say first, but I pulled this card. So in my new tarot workbook, there's an opening ritual and a 3-card spread. And the third question in the spread was um, something like, how can I evolve, or what can I expect if I kind of stay the course, if I continue with this exploration? And the card I got for that was the Emperor. I was like, oh, interesting. So my question for the Emperor today is, what does that energy look like for me? Or like what aspect of self will that Emperor draw out?
So can you say your question in another way?
Because it was too wordy.
I just seeking clarity.
My question is, what does the Emperor energy look like for me in this context? Oh, interesting. I got 8 of Cups.
Hmm.
I'm going to sit on that for a second. Let's talk about your question.
First, I'm just finding the Emperor in this deck, and oh, here he is. Okay, so the Brady Tarot is they're like Linnecuts, and I believe they're all animals and plants that are native to North America. And it was done in Denver, Colorado, and they're all 79 hand-colored Linnecuts. So carved by hand and then printed onto paper. So It looks like we have the emperor is, let me see if I can find where in the guidebook it talks about what the animal is. So this is a bull elk, and he is on top of a mountain, and he is bugling his power. So he's uh, just on top of the mountain, hooting, making noise.
Yes.
So I guess my question to the emperor is, so yours was sort of about like what aspects of yourself do you need to bring to the fore within the context of the emperor?
Like, what does this look like for me? If indeed I stay the course and step more into this emperor energy, but like, yeah, like some context, some flavor on that.
So yeah, I guess my question would be sort of similar, is like, how can I embody the emperor energy today for the highest good and healing of all, myself included?
It's a much more selfless question.
No, myself included. It's like, how can I, how's it going to be good for myself and the collective simultaneously? That's a consistent question for me. So I got the world.
Oh, what a beautiful card, too.
Yeah,
That's
it's really
amazing.
gorgeous. So what do you make of the Eight of Cups for your question?
I feel a little deflated, honestly, by this. Though I do love the Eight of Cups as a teacher, as a guide.
Yeah, it's one of the journey cards to me. That and like the Six of Swords, right?
Yeah, and this one, I think of this one as walking away from something that doesn't serve you any longer in your growth, even though on its face it may not be like a hot mess or disaster or a shit
Hmm.
show. Like your friends may not all be telling you to run from the situation because it's clear to everyone that it's a problem. It's more subtle than that. It's like an
Hmm.
internal knowing that the situation, the dynamic isn't like you've kind of gotten all the juice out of it. And you know that to stay would just be like a little stagnant for you, that there's growth and challenge elsewhere, but you have to depart in order to find it. You kind of have to like wander into the dark of the unknown future to find it. I do think the emperor, especially given what we talked about with like energy leaks or internal boundaries, would be a good guide for determining if you're in an Eight of Cups kind of moment. But it feels deflating to me here because it's like, oh, you get to step into this emperor energy, which could look a lot of different ways, only to turn around and walk away or something.
Hmm.
I'm sure you see something more helpful.
So the flip side of the Eight of Cups for me is it's a journey of seeking, right? So like for example, in the Six of Swords, it's an emissary, right? We're going across troubled waters. There's not a seeking necessarily. It's like we have gone and this is the natural progression of healing or whatever. But there's a very active energy in the Eight of Cups, in that I focus when I pull it on more of like, I need to go to get something that's missing, right? Because the way the cups are organized, it's sort of like you see that space between them, and you're like, oh, there's a cup there that you got to go get in order to get to the Nine of Cups, right?
Hmm.
And so it, for me, it talks about, there's more about seeking or looking for something or exploring. I'm thinking about like the quest for the Holy Grail, whether you're looking at the Monty Python version or otherwise, is like it was a circuitous journey, right? Like we don't know exactly where the Grail is, but like we do know that we need to like just explore. And so I think that's what it evokes for me when I see the Eight of Cups. Not that you like have to sort of, you're leaving something for the moment because you got to go get something to complete the set, you know?
Mm, okay, that's really helpful. And it makes me think a lot of what you shared in this conversation also brought up for me this idea of having your own back. I think it is connected to that idea of self sovereignty or personal authority. So, this idea that you can take yourself wherever you need to go and support yourself in that context, kind of like self trust. Like, I can trust myself, even if other people in the room are like, what the fuck are you talking about? Or you don't belong here, or like, or you just don't feel like you fit. There's still something inside you that has a container for you to feel still connected to your being, your beautiful being, your power, your sovereignty, and the awareness that like wherever you are, the external circumstances aren't don't need to define you, I guess.
Mhm.
But let's talk about you pulling the world right now. That's pulling the world is so this really like can you see why now you're the obvious choice for this episode?
Because the tarot said so. Like, bitch, you've arrived. It's fine. I'm like, what? Okay.
Accept
What?
it.
What's arrival? I don't know. Yeah. I've been pulling the world a lot in the last couple, like just the last 3 days. It's come up
Mm.
uh, consistently. So yeah, we talk about what completion, right, and a sense of wholeness. But often when I pull cards for myself, I will get a little too analytical. So, what are your thoughts on this one for me?
I feel like it's an affirmation that, for one thing, you're asking a great and beautiful question. And also that this perhaps is your work and your journey, not like that it's only one thing, but, in so many, as you've shared in this conversation, there's so many layers and contexts in which you're exploring this, not only how you express your gender and how you feel into your Empress and into your Emperor and how you combine them in a lot of different ways at different moments, but also you're, like going to social work school, you're inside the institution. You have to do what the institution wants you to do to like get through and get the the degrees and the certifications that you're seeking. But you're also in there um, trying to create change and not just like accepting the institution at its face, but also seeing yourself as an agent of change. And how do you want to respond to this environment that you've chosen, not just for yourself so that you can be paid better, but for all your colleagues who are going through the same thing. And even the people, let's say, above you who have like faculty positions or something like that. And that this question of like responsiveness and responsibility and holding containers and recognizing your own self-authority, but also empowering other people to see their self-authority is like just a huge part of the impact that I think you are already making and have made and continue to make as you explore this. And the world needs you.
The world.
Such a beautiful card. I love that you
It
pulled
is.
that.
I love it. She's like the end. That's the end of this episode. We've completed it.
Bye.
Well, thank you so much for having me for this episode. It's really fun to talk about the Emperor with you.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and all that you shared. This is wonderful wisdom. And I think that many folks out there who may have looked askance at the Emperor will feel perhaps a more resonant connection with this card going forward.
I hope so. It's taken me a bit, so I get it, y'all.
Give it time, be patient.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Big thanks to Kelly for this juicy, rich, multifaceted exploration of the Emperor. I hope this has helped you see this card in new ways and think about how it can apply to your life and what it can mean for you. One way to think about this card, I'm thinking about the prompt that I included in my new workbook, Tarot for Creative Spirits, where there's a journaling prompt for every card in the tarot. For the Emperor, one creative prompt on that page asks you to draw a scenario or collage or visually in some way represent, create an image in which you are very large. So you make yourself just like really big compared to everything else in the picture. You need to have other things in the picture so that we can see the scale of you being very big. And part of the point of that is for you to then investigate what it felt like to make yourself really big, to take up more space, to seem very visible, which an emperor, that's a quality the emperor would have. And I think the emperor asks us, invites us into a bit more bigness in our lives, taking more ownership, seeing ourselves as more powerful and autonomous. And so yeah, you can create some visual representation of you where you're really big. Have fun with it. Like you can make yourself so gigantic. You can be like Godzilla sized if you want. And then the reflection after that is just like, how do you feel when you see that? What did it feel like to make yourself represent yourself in that way? And what feelings come up for you when you kind of look at yourself in this drawing, in this visual representation as quite huge? How does that feel? What comes up for you? What tenderness does it touch upon? Where does it feel twitchy? Where does it feel exciting? So that's just a place to explore if you want to get into a little more depth with this card. I recommend you try that out, see what happens. If you are enjoying this exploration of tarot and life and creativity and magic, I think you might love my new book, Tarot for Creative Spirits. I was just talking about it. You can get your copy. It's going to help you expand your understanding of tarot through the lens of your own personal life. All the journaling prompts are about you. Some are serious, some are playful, some are for planning, some are just like fucking around, having fun. In the process, you also go through some really exciting self discovery. You're going to be talking with yourself in ways that you haven't maybe done before. And you're going to discover some incredible things about you, you incredible person. So if you're interested in the book, head over to typewritertarot.com, look around in the shop, you will find it there. I hope it serves you well. It will definitely enrich your relationship with tarot and enrich your relationship with yourself. And the better relationship we have with ourselves, the more magical and creative our lives will be. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you again soon.